but essentially we're here to build bridges between all stakeholders, and we use the internet a lot to make that happen. For this particular session, the content was provided by Jane Perlmutter and myself, and I put together the slide deck. Please feel free to ask questions at the end. But remember, we're not doctors, we're not giving advice, we're not making recommendations, we're just providing information and training. Here's today's learning objectives. By the end of the session, participants will be able to better understand how to review a concept, better understand how to review a protocol, and learn important advocate tips to improve those documents. So here is the overview, how we're going to structure those learning objectives. We're going to start with the perfect storm. It's a slide that I use for many, many, many talks, and it's just to ground us once again in the patient experience. Then we'll talk about where advocates come in. Again, that's just to ground us in the conversation. And then we're actually going to dig really deeply into a protocol and how to review it. We'll talk about accrual issues, we'll talk about some protections in place, and this is just a little bit of background information so that you have a good solid grounding in that area, so that if people ask you about clinical trials, you'll have some information, and then we'll sum up. So as you know, when someone's diagnosed, they go into a state of shock and fear. And I like to term that the perfect storm. They've got a complicated looking form. There's very, very few graphic handouts. There's incomplete staff training. I've been involved with quite a few sites, and the majority, maybe 90% of their training is actually on regulatory issues. How to collect data, how to meet all the requirements for submitting that data and ensuring its accuracy. Very, very, very little training on how to talk to somebody about a clinical trial. Very little training on how to help people understand the difference between standard of care and a study trial. So when I say incomplete staff training, that's what I'm referring to. Not enough time. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, most researchers don't allow as much time to make a clinical trial decision as they allow to make a treatment decision. And sometimes that's the same exact person. And in the clinic, they give people 2 or 3 visits, so maybe an hour with them. But when they talk about a clinical trial, they usually hand them off to somebody, and it's a 15-minute, sometimes one-stop visit. So there usually is not enough time. There's all the different cultural differences that are in play, and we talked a lot about that last session. Low literacy rates, again, we talked about that. Different learning styles, all of this is in play. And usually you see people turning and walking away. I mean, we don't have that 3 to 5% accrual rate except for all of these. It's a real problem. So what we've been suggesting as a nonprofit for probably the last 10 years is to make sure there's graphic handouts, make sure that the staff has some patient-centered staff training, allow more time, always address cultural differences, health literacy, and learning styles, and hopefully, we can turn this into an interactive consent process. So this is just a slide that I like to start almost all of my trainings with, to ground you in the fact that this is tough. This is tough for a patient to get past this. This is a hurdle that we're going to try to help researchers get past. So where do we come in? Again, I've used this slide up at the top a lot. You don't get to bedside without clinical trials. That includes the community we're part of. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Essentially, we're the bridge. Our job, as we discussed last time, was to act as a focus group, to try to put that bridge and get that conversation back and forth between the researchers and the patient community they're trying to reach. So here's why our review is important, because really the scientists are focusing on what they care about, which is usually a scientific question. And we're providing that reality check. We're that in-house focus group. We're telling them, you know, is this really important? Is this just a science question? Is it going to change outcomes? Is it feasible? Can you do it? Can it be done other places? We're there to help make adjustments to make sure that that happens. I think it's also important, and kind of why we're doing this training, is to create a paper trail of advocate input. We talked a little bit about last time accountability, how really tough it is to track what we've done and to be able to say, well, here's where we made an impact. Well, here's what we did. So one of the things we've done, and so I've been a part of 3 groups. I was a part of Akron, I was a part of ACOSOG, and now I'm a part of the Alliance. And each group does it a different process, and what we've tried to encourage across all groups is somehow to have a paper copy, a paper record of comments that advocates have made as they review concepts and protocols. If you don't do that, there's really no way at the end to know what impact you've had. Sometimes you need to find the admin person who tracks these. Each protocol will have an admin person and say, can I submit my comments in writing, so that you have a digital record of that? Can we put that together somehow? I think if any of the groups have great ideas that they found to track this, it would be wonderful to hear from you, and we could do that a little bit at the end on the question part, or you can send me those suggestions by email. But I think that's one of the toughest things that we do. On conference calls, it's even tougher. As the concept is coming along, we could say this or we could say that, and if the secretary doesn't record that, that admin person doesn't record that, it's lost. So it's almost up to us to record that and find somebody to submit it to. So let's start digging right into the protocol and how to review it. Everybody's role here is a little bit different. Some groups may only review concepts, which comes before a protocol. Some groups may only review the protocol. They actually never get the concept. Some groups don't review the consent form. So we're going to set this talk up such that you're reviewing the concept and then the protocol. And if you're not doing that as a group, and you've got somebody in leadership that you can go to and say, here's what we would prefer to do, hopefully that can happen. So here's a little bit about the process. That concept starts with an idea from an individual researcher, and usually it starts at a home institution. Usually there's pilot data. Usually they've done a phase 1 study, sometimes even a phase 2, and it can take a year or more. They have to line up funding for their small study. It's difficult and it can take a long time. Often, once that pilot data is in, then they move it to a phase 2 or 3 and bring it to the network or cooperative group. And this can take another year or more. So just the concept is something that takes quite a bit of time. There are some concepts that are generated and percolated up within the network group itself. So an organ committee might say, how about if we start studying this? Why don't we do a clinical trial about that? So some concepts do percolate up right within the committee itself. It could be the prevention committee, it could be an organ site committee, but a lot of concepts start outside the network from individual institutions. Because remember, each one of these researchers, their advancement is based on publishing clinical trial data. And so they usually do small phase 1s, phase 2s. After they get the cooperative or network group approval for that concept, then it moves to a written protocol. So they all start at the concept level. Hopefully you're involved at that concept level, because here's your chance really early on to say, you know, why are we doing this? Why are we spending time and money and the patient population to get an answer that really isn't going to change a whole lot? So if you're not reviewing concepts, you can go back to your group and say, we would like to get in as early as possible at the concept level so we can make some of these comments, get some, because once the protocol is at that level, once a concept has been approved and moves all the way to a protocol, it's a lot harder to add things and to stop it. And there are some concepts that you just feel shouldn't move forward. And it's important that that advocate voice be heard. And at the end, you have to have the NCI approval, CTEP, and we'll go through that a little bit more through here. I because I'm a visual person, I like to put it all into a little bit of a graph too. And so with the person there, that's the idea usually at the home institution, although it could happen at the network. It starts with that concept, and it could go up or down. There's many, 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 many concepts that don't get a thumbs up, that are shot down by that group. The NC stands for the network group, if it's a breast or GI or respiratory. Each group is fielding concepts that come to them. They're discussing them. There's calls about that. You'll want to make sure that you're on those calls. Each group has a different way to see that happens. And I think one of the important parts for this entire talk is that the structure has to be in place. It has to be written down. All the head people have to know where you're involved. If it's flexible and you don't hear about things in a routine manner, it's a lot harder to make something happen. So as the groups have come together, it's gotten tougher for us, actually, because we've moved from small groups that were functioning for years into these much larger groups that are coming together with all kinds of different people. And we're trying to fit in to the new structure that's being formatted. So ask if you can't see what that structure is. How does the concept move through? How does the protocol move through? Where are those calls happening? And make sure your people are on that email list that gets sent out. So once that network group approves it, then it actually goes to the committee. And so, or it starts at the committee and then goes to the network group. Sometimes they don't get out of the group. Sometimes at the higher level of the group, because the group is looking at a portfolio, where the committee is looking at just their committee. So sometimes it may be a wonderful idea, but it doesn't quite fit into what the group is concerned about, and that would be the alliance or whichever group you're a part of. So it could get turned down at that group level. If it makes it past the group level, then it goes to CTEP for approval. And a lot of these are back and forth. These arrows actually should have little back and forth, because CTEP will say, well, you know, we like this, this, and this, but we don't like that. So it goes back to the group, which might send it back to the committee. So sometimes this is not one straight shot through. It could go back and forth a couple times, which is part of why this all takes so long. If CTEP does approve it or have conditions in it, and those conditions are met, and then finally gets approval, then it goes back to the group and back to the committee, which then writes a full protocol. And some groups the advocates may only be involved at this level. Some groups, the advocates don't get involved at the protocol level. They only get involved at the concept level. And so it's really best if you can be involved at both the concept and the protocol level, because the same process then happens, but it gets hammered out and all the details are laid out. And there's new things that will come up and new suggestions you can make. So again, it's going to come through the committee, it's going to come back through the group, it's going to go back to CTEP, and CTEP again may say, well, we like this or that, but we don't like this, and fix it. So once that's happened, they tend to send it to the CIRB, and then to individual IRBs. And at that point, it would be an open trial, and recruitment could start. So this is kind of the process. Make sure that in each of your groups you know where that is, and you're on all the correct calls and meetings to voice your suggestions. So now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what a protocol is. And really, it's just a standardized written action plan. It's like a recipe. For beginning chefs, every single ingredient is measured and detailed out. Clinical trials are the exact same way. Every single aspect of what's going to happen has to be written and detailed out. The MCI has some required categories, and we're going to talk about those. Every study site has to follow it exactly the same way, because you can't compare apples to oranges, and that's why you have a protocol, to make sure that you're comparing apples and apples. Some people like Starbucks coffee because they know wherever they go, it's going to taste the same. And so a protocol is designed such that every single person, whether they're in a clinical trial in Cleveland or Buffalo or LA, it's the exact same steps are going to happen. They're going to be treated the same way. So that's what that action plan is, or the protocol. It's an action plan. And it has to include a consent form. That's one of the required elements. And the consent form is the only piece that the patient usually gets. Some sites will give a protocol to a patient if they ask. Some sites say no. But it's important to know that, you know, there are people who want to see that full protocol. And most sites allow that to happen. But again, the patient learns almost everything that they need to make that decision from the consent form. So the newest version, the NCI is always updating that standard form. We'll put it on our website in the toolkit section. It explains what the study and other options are. And that's actually a new feature that was just put in about a year ago. They used to just be able to use general categories like you could receive another type of chemo. Now they have to be much more specific, and that's really helpful. And those suggestions came from advocates who were sitting in those meetings, and I was one of those advocates. People need to know exactly what those choices are, because sometimes there is no other time, but when they're reading that consent form, that those two parts are put next to each other, the standard of care versus the clinical trial. So the consent form now has to do that for them. It also has to lay out all the risks and possible benefits. And as an advocate, the most important part for us is that it needs to be written so that it could be understood. Unfortunately, when I showed you that schema of how a concept and protocol moves through, that can take a couple of years, lots of time, lots of effort, lots of people working on it, and yet often the consent form is a copy and paste from some standard document, and it's put together, and everyone looks just like the other one except for tiny little changes based on what the new drug or new treatment is going to be. And that's not good. So we want to really be involved at the consent form review stage to make sure that that consent form is written so that the patient really understands what's going on. So here's all of the parts of a protocol. These sometimes change as far as what they're called, but there'll always be a background or an introduction. There'll always be a study hypothesis followed by the study design plan. The rationale is sort of why they're doing it. They'll have to talk about eligibility. They'll have to give the statistical design and list all the risks and benefits. It's required to put in a schema or flow chart. They have to have the informed consent document. And people are beginning to realize that they have to start addressing feasibility. We're going to go into each of these topics, and we're going to not only talk a little bit about what it means, but then the questions that would be helpful for you as you're looking through that protocol. Here's what you would be questioning the researcher about. So that's almost the entire purpose of today's webinar, is to give you those tips for each of these background areas. So let's start with the background. What it is it's an introduction. It should include a good review of what's already been done, plus the new idea, plus the new research that's going to happen. That's where the pilot data shows up. That's where they talk about why they're doing what they're doing. It should have a very specific scientific question. It should also include a plan on how they are going to approach the question. It could be a drug, a surgical procedure, a diagnostic test, or a prevention, but all of that would be discussed in the background. And I know when I review a protocol, that's one area where I spend a lot of time, is reading why are they doing this? Really understand what research question they're asking and why it's important to get that answer. That's where the justification for doing the clinical trial will show up, is in this background section. So here's some questions for you. I don't move forward to the next section until I understand this. And I like to write it down. The Alliance has a form that we can use. Some people use it and some people don't. I like forms. When I was with Akron and ACOSOD, they each had a form as well. So if you happen to have a review form that you're proud of and you'd like to share, please send it and we'll post it with where it came from. I think it's always important that we continue to refine what we have and to put heads together and get better. So what is the study question? What are they? Why are they doing this clinical trial? And again, our focus group had is, what does that answer mean to the patient? Hopefully, most of the trials that come before the network groups are going to be to produce better outcomes, or could be quality of life. Every once in a while, you'll still see a science only or research question only one sneak through in a cooperative or network group. Those are better done at a site where it's smaller, where that answer maybe needed to happen, but maybe not at the network. It's important to know how long the clinical trial will last. Will it take too long? All of that should be discussed there in the background. And again, what type of study is it? So get your head around what's happening before you move deeper into the protocol. Make sure you understand these background questions. And you ask questions to the researchers. Should we be doing this? There'll always be a study hypothesis, and this kind of sums up the whole entire background. We hypothesize that blank, blank, blank action will lead to whatever outcome. And remember that researchers are going to have things that are important to them. Funders are going to have things that are important to them. And as patients, representatives, advocates for patients, we have things that are important to us. So I think the study hypothesis helps condense what's happening, and it's a good way to make sure that you really do understand why they're doing the study. And so here's the kinds of things that you'll want to make sure you understand. And I think the most important part here is, will the result matter to patients? If you don't have a solid belief in that, then you would want to discuss that. And if you could discuss it at the concept level, that's the best time to do it. Where you would say, you know, why are we doing this? Do we really want to take our time and money and effort on this particular question? So here's where you would answer that, right here in the hypothesis. Do we want to do it? Then they move to a study design. And each study has a very specific structural design. There's some very standard formats. We're just talking a little bit about it here because Patty is going to do an entire training on clinical trial, and it'll have a lot more on design. But some of the types of designs are randomized, stratified, blinded. There's newer designs, the adaptive, the umbrella, the basket. All of those will be discussed by Patty, but it's in this section of the protocol where they talk about the study design. And here's the kind of questions that we would ask in that section. How does the study design compare to standard of care? Make sure you're really clear about that. That means you'll have to know what standard of care is for this patient population. And if you don't know, then ask somebody. Do you feel that the demands on the patients are reasonable? Here's where you could say, you know, do you really need that second biopsy? Do you really need that third MRI? Is that extra visit, can you combine that MRI with their doctor visit where they're getting chemo? Can you combine some things to limit the extra visits coming in? So these are questions that you'll be asking all through the study design section. How many treatment arms are there? Is it randomized or blinded? Is crossover allowed? And if it's not, why not? People are finally beginning to allow that to happen a little more. It takes longer. It's harder statistically, so you need more people. But more people would be willing to enter a clinical trial if they knew that they could cross over to another arm. And so it's a discussion worth having every time if that answer is no. Why? Why is it no? How many people are you going to need? Is this really doable? If the number is so large and the population of people that this fits is small, this could take a very long time. And maybe that question isn't so important in 4 years. So it's important to know that. It's also important to know if correlative studies are going to be included. And more often they will be. I mean, the whole precision medicine is based on correlative studies. So I think probably from here on in, they're going to be there. And that's all good. Make sure you ask if those studies are done on a central CLIA lab. If not, have a discussion about apples and oranges and all the problems that have ensued over the last 10 years as we ramped up in this area, one site not being able to match another site. So hopefully all correlative studies are done in the central CLIA lab. Find out what the endpoints are. This is where they're going to talk about it. Overall survival is best, but it's not always doable. And each study group, it's harder to do. So it's important to know your patient population. It's important to know what the next step is. For some organ sites, they may be moving closer to that. For some organs, that sites, maybe not. Maybe, you know, overall survival is still not where they are yet. So find out. This is where you would ask. This is where you would find out what the endpoints are. So rationale and study objective, they always put this in. I've never been able to understand why, because it's almost kind of the same thing as the background and the hypothesis. It's another explanation of why the study is being done. And they write it up, again, some people write the exact same thing. Some people write up a little bit different. Again, they've got to put the endpoints in there. One thing that I have found a couple times, because, again, people are cutting and pasting from this paper and that paper and this study and that study, is does the hypothesis match the goals of the study? And the hypothesis could state that the trial will increase survival, but they don't have any endpoints to measure survival. So, you know, make sure that the goals and the hypothesis match. So under this section, you would ask, why have you chosen drug A? Why this drug? Why are we studying this instead of that? It's a chance for you to get the researchers to explain in a little more detail why they're taking the approach that they're taking. And is there another approach that may be a little more impactful? Remember, each of these starts with some specific researcher or PI with an idea. And it may be his pet idea, and he may have focused the last 5 years of his career on this idea. But maybe it doesn't mean that much to everybody else, and somebody's got to say that. You know, why are we doing this? And we're kind of the people who can make those kind of suggestions, because again, politics are in play, and depending on who's presenting the study and who's presenting the protocol, the newer PIs and researchers may not be willing to say, you know, I really don't think we should be doing this. So sometimes those questions fall back to us. Will that result really matter to a patient? Will the outcome be better? If the outcome's not better, will quality of life be better, or side effects? Will they be less? Will there be a lower cost? All of these things could figure into it, but somehow it's got to matter to patients. And then do you feel that the demands on the patients are reasonable? And we've already talked about that a little bit. So eligibility, that's who can enter a specific clinical trial. And I don't know if you've ever taken the time to read eligibility criteria, but they can go on for pages. There's a must-have, and that's very detailed. You must have this. It has to be this stage. You have to have a certain health status criteria. So there's a whole lot of things you have to have. And then there's a whole bunch of things you can't have. And those are comorbidities. Maybe you've got diabetes or a heart condition or something, and they're looking for all of that. You don't want people in there that may have problems within the study that really aren't connected to the new treatment, but are really connected to their overall health. So they try to separate all those people out, as well as prior treatments. And here's some of the questions that you would ask. So you would find out who's included and why, and then who is excluded and why. And over the years, we've found more and more, and researchers, statisticians, and advocates began to question. Maybe a narrow eligibility is not the best thing, because it doesn't generalize. Once a drug makes its way through and gets out to the general population, some drugs have fallen flat because that eligibility criteria was so narrow that it looked good, but over a wider population, it doesn't. So the thinking in the last 5 to 10 years has been stretch that eligibility, get it wider, get it almost as wide as you can. So if you're looking at an eligibility and you think, gee, you know, why can't this group be in it or that group? Raise those questions. These are some of the questions that you can be asking as you're reviewing the protocol. And unfortunately, we're now to the stage where if you're only reviewing the concept, you may not be involved with some of these next steps because the concepts sometimes don't talk about this as much. So that's why you really want to say, if you're only reviewing a concept in your network group, we would like to begin to review protocols as well. And you can talk about some of these other areas as we go through it. You want to be involved in those discussions. You want to ask these types of questions. We also can ask, will the study be open in sites with diverse populations? One of the groups I was with, they got dinged during the final review period by the NCI when they were submitting their next grant because of low diversity in their accrual. And I asked, I said, you know, have you ever overlaid a census map with the sites that you're opening with? And the answer was no. And you can't expect diverse populations to be in a study where you're not open. If they live here and you're not open there, then it's going to be real tough to get a diverse population. So there's some simple questions we can be asking. Just make sure that you have sites open where you have a chance of getting a diverse population. It's important to capture results for everyone. The NCI is requiring it, but it doesn't happen all the time, and somehow it just keeps slipping by year after year. So the statistics section, this is for some people the toughest section. It's where it's the toughest to have comments that are helpful because it's hard to understand what these terms mean. P-value is the big one, and what they're trying to do is determine if the likelihood of the result is due to chance, and that number is less than 0.05 or 1 in 20. You want to make sure that whatever you're doing is not due to chance, but is actually due to the intervention. So that's what that p-value is. Then we've got confidence interval, sample size, and relative risk. Those are all key terms, and they're here. You can look through them. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them. Patty will talk a little bit more of those in the clinical trials section. Here's a little bit on understanding endpoints, because again, that's what we're looking for. An endpoint is a measurable outcome that shows an intervention's effectiveness. It can be primary, which is the main focus. Lots of protocols have a secondary in addition to. Sometimes it's tumor response rate. Sometimes it's disease-free survival or progression-free survival. As advocates, we prefer overall survival, but know what the endpoints are. Here's their definition, so you can go back to them anytime. Here's some more definitions, because I think it's helpful to know that people will be looking at clinical endpoints, which is actually that patient. How does that patient feel, function, survive? It's an actual clinical endpoint. More and more as we go into precision medicine, there are biomarker endpoints. And that's something that's measured in the lab. And they're hoping to get to blood or urine. Right now, often it's in tissue. But biomarkers are where we're moving, and surrogate endpoints are more and more looked at as valuable endpoints, because you can see what's happening before the course of breast cancer may be 10 or 15 years out from the treatment. That's a long time to wait to see if anything was effective. If you can find a surrogate endpoint, a biomarker that will tell you if that treatment was helpful, that would be really, really good. So more and more often, trials are set up to measure not only the clinical endpoint, but also the surrogate endpoint. Is this a good biomarker, and can we use this? to substitute for a clinical endpoint. So we can know maybe within a couple months after treatment whether that treatment was effective. So more and more often, these will be included, and they're important, and you can ask, do you have biomarkers or surrogate endpoints? And if not, why not? Can we add some? Is there a correlative study that can get tied into this protocol? Lots of times researchers keep protocols narrow, and as advocates we can try to get as much information from any one clinical trial that you could possibly get. And if studying a biomarker and a surrogate endpoint could be added, that would be good information. So let's talk a little bit about risk versus benefit. This is one of those really tough areas for patients. There are some possible benefits. You could gain access to a new treatment that's not yet available. You're going to get expert medical care. You'll be watched closer than other people. There was a recent study that was just published that 60% of people who did enter a clinical trial did so because they wanted to help others. And that's a very, very tiny section of the consent form. But it turns out to be a high motivator for a lot of people. So it's important in the consent form that it's really well established that potentially you're entering in this clinical trial. It may not benefit you, but it may benefit future patients, and that's usually how they say it. But if you could flush that out in a little more than a sentence, which is what it usually is, it turns out this matters to people, and it's one of the motivators. Of course, clinical trials may also have some risks. There may be serious, even life-threatening side effects that they didn't count on. And it may be a combination of treatments. It may be the drug itself. They may not be as effective as standard of care. There could be a lot of extra tests or visits or times you have to come in to see the doctor. And unfortunately, health insurance may not cover all the study costs or if there's a problem with one of the drugs. So it's things that people need to understand. Here's some of the things that we can bring up and be sure that we know is that people have different risk comfort levels. One of the toughest things, I think, for anybody entering a clinical trial is that the consent form requires that all of those risks and benefits be written down. And yet, most oncologists don't write down the risks of their standard of care or the benefits either. And usually, if you put those two right next to each other, they would be very close. But when you don't hear it for the standard, and you do hear 2 pages of things that really look pretty scary, it is one of those areas that is hard for people to get over. And I'm not quite sure how the best way to deal with this is. As a nonprofit, we've put some decision aids together that help people, but as advocates for a network group, I think it's just always important to let people know that researchers know that it's going to be tough for people to get past this section if you can't somehow explain what the standard of care risks are. Possible benefit is stated usually just to help future patients. And so I think part of what we can do is help them encourage a fuller explanation of that. So the schema or the flow chart, again, this is required, and it's just a very structured layout of what the study design looks like in an image format. They'll usually have this in written format during the background section and the study design section, but they also have to insert a schema. I always think it's important that they read left to right, not top to bottom. If you look at them, 90% of them read top to bottom, although they're beginning to move left to right. And here's some other specific comments to make it as friendly as possible. So here's what I think we can add. Is that schema understandable? Is it in the calendar timeline format versus boxes of first you're going to do this and then you're going to do this? Is it in a timeline format? Is it color-coded? Almost never. Even if they use black dots and black slashes, and because a lot of places don't have color printers, they just don't. But somehow code what needs to be done and try to compare it to standard of care. Find a place to highlight those extra visits and tests. And again, reading left to right. Does it compare standard of care to study? I think the best way to do this is to show you a couple of examples. And so here's one from an old study, probably 15 years ago. And it was a research-only study, and this is what most of the schemas look like. They're little white boxes with little arrows, and you move through it. And researchers understand that. You know, as advocates, we can learn to understand that. We see them, we know what they're doing. But if you give this to a patient, that's really tough to expect them to understand what that means. So here's what I did. I redesigned that schema that you just saw, and this was a standard of care with a research question on top of it. So everybody was going to do standard of care. There was nothing in the research study other than a couple biopsies and a couple MRIs to learn information. So here's what we did. We put out this paper. This is what standard of care, that you're going to do exactly what you would have done if you weren't in the study. Now, if you're in the study, we're also going to ask you to do this. And they just, they could do this on an iPad. They could do it with a piece of paper. We had a clear insert that went over it for those sites that didn't have technology. And all of a sudden, it became much clearer. Oh, you're going to ask me for some extra biopsies. And you're going to ask me for a couple extra MRIs and an extra mammogram. That's what that study is about in a nutshell. Way easier to understand that than that all those white boxes. So there's things that can be done to help people. As you see, this is laid out in a time format, and it's color-coded, and it's very easy to see standard of care versus the study. So moving into the informed consent document, again, this is the only thing most patients have at their disposal to understand what that clinical trial is about. When we're reviewing it, we've got the whole protocol, every little detail of it. So that consent document really needs to explain the aspects. People are required to sign it. You can't move forward without it. Again, it's got very specific required elements, just like a protocol does. Amendments can be added, and they often are. You don't like to see that happen because it takes time. It has to go back through the IRBs again. But here's some of the things that we could be asking about. And the most important one is it understandable. You know, I actually like to have a checklist of these kinds of questions. When I review something, I actually put all of this together, and I have yeses and nos, and then when I'm discussing it with somebody or rating it with somebody, I can go back and say, you know, this is why I have a problem. Are there educational materials attached to that consent form? Remember that very, very first slide today where we saw that if somebody just hears an auditory presentation of here's this clinical trial and they're handed a form to sign, it's tough. It helps if there's education materials. Is the new NCI template being used? And I think we're out far enough now, so that's probably always the case. So I think probably we don't have to be as worried about it, but you'll know if it's the new NCI template because it starts with here's standard of care, and they have to detail out what standard of care is. And I'll also post this in our toolkit. I'll post that template. Does it compare study to standard of care? And almost always that answer is no. And I think that's really a shame, because patients need to know that. What happens in the event of an injury or loss of confidentiality, all of that is explained in the consent form. We're not going to talk too much more about it today because we have our next webinar. The entire hour is on the consent form. So we'll go through this really detailed. So can the patient take it home? Always encourage that that happened. We'll talk in 2 weeks at the next webinar a whole lot about the consent form and how you can review it. So here's some other issues, and that's feasibility. And it didn't used to be in the protocols. Now they're more and more in protocols because the NCI has kind of said, you know, we're tired of opening clinical trial after clinical trial and closing them. People just don't accrue. Sometimes we're the only one that's going to say, you know, I don't think this is going to ever accrue. Can it be done in a community setting? Advocate input is really critical here. It's more than just the number of patients and the sites. It doesn't matter. Can it be transferable? Those are questions we need to ask. And it's important that we're honest with that. Do you think people would actually enter this trial? Why and why not? And I write them out. Do you think the numbers in the trial are attainable? It's easy to say we'll get 20 people every month, but is that doable? So then you need to know how many people are in that subpopulation that's being studied. How long to reach those accrual numbers? Is it realistic? Can they really do it? If it's for a tiny subgroup and they've got a pretty large number, maybe that's not going to happen. And you remember, these researchers, they want to open this clinical trial. So it's kind of up to us to say, you know, I don't think this is going to happen. What do you see as a barrier to accrual, and can you reduce that barrier? We'll talk about that in the next slide or so. But here's where you would want to go into it on the feasibility issue. So let's dig into accrual, because more and more time is spent here as less money is available. It's important that every study really look at this thoroughly and the protocol address it so that it doesn't come afterwards, so that it's actually addressed in the protocol with steps in place right at the beginning. This is just background. We won't spend much time on it. You can go back to these slides because these really don't apply as much to us today, but there are barriers from the physician point of view. It's why some sites won't open studies. They're afraid of losing the patient. They already may believe that standard care is best. So it's sometimes tough to get enough sites open, and that's why, because their physicians and providers have some barriers themselves. And patients may be unaware of a clinical trial. They may lack access to a trial. They may be suspicious of risk. There may be personal obstacles like travel, time off from work. There may be insurance, or they just may have a low risk profile where you put them in a spot where, you know, now they're diagnosed with cancer. They're not going to take any other chances. They want the best standard of care there is. So there are people with a low risk profile who, even in the best of conditions, would say no, let alone being diagnosed. So, and for some people, it's just one decision too many. So there's a whole lot going on with patients that maybe you can't fix. Maybe you can make that protocol as good as it's going to be. The researcher's got an excellent question. You've covered all the areas, but each person comes with their own risk profile and may just say no just because of who they are. But there definitely are benefits to participating. We don't get the new treatments without moving through the clinical trial. We know that studies don't get to the phase 3 level unless people are very sure that it's going to be at minimum the same as standard of care. There are studies that turn out not to be, but most at minimum are the same standard of care, if not better. They may be the first to benefit. They will have a chance to help others. Again, we've talked about most of these. They'll receive closer supervision. And for some people, they'll receive care that they might not otherwise have been able to afford. And so, unfortunately, that's the motivation for some people. There are risks. We've talked about all of these before, but here they are laid out again, and they'll be in the consent form. And I think let's spend a little bit of time now really on the educational materials, because learning style really does matter. We've talked about this in our last webinar, that patients learn best when there's a match between their preferred learning style and the presentation style. You can't really account for that with people all across the country consenting, but we should assume that once people are diagnosed, that they've become a visual learner, because they're in shock and they're in fear and they're not processing and they're not retaining. And so if we can assume that they are now a visual learner, then you need some education materials. You shouldn't be explaining something as technical and as tough as a clinical trial to somebody with just a consent form. So here's adjustments that we made at Akron. This is a brochure. The brochure on the left was the one that was designed by the cooperative group. They used words that contralateral breast, most people have no idea. They may not know what an MRI is. They probably don't know what contralateral breast is. There's research study numbers almost always on these brochures. It doesn't tell you a lot, and it's not inviting. So what we did is we suggest change the words. Imaging your cancer-free breast. Are you a breast cancer patient with concerns about your healthy breast? If you saw that in the office waiting room, you would be much more likely to pick that up. There's a picture, there's a question, there aren't words that you don't understand. So I think as educational materials are being developed, it's important that we critique them the same way we would a protocol. Make sure that there's pictures, make sure that there aren't words that people don't understand. I think we can do a lot to help in that area. And for a good accrual communication plan, you want to do that before the study is activated. And that means you develop the education materials, you work with the advocates, you work with the community leaders and other groups. So this is something you would say as that protocol is coming through. What's your accrual plan? What's your communication plans? Why aren't we doing this? Can we do that? Maybe we should add this. During the study, I think there should be a form where you can ask patients who say no, why? So that you can make adjustments as they go through. There is probably no other group that doesn't capture data about the group that they're trying to reach, except during a clinical study. So I put together a screening chart, and that's what we called it, and we've used it in a few studies that we've been involved with as a collaborator, and I'll put that in the toolkit. You can bring it up anytime. You can say, this study is not accruing, and why? If you don't ask patients, everything else is just a guess, our guess, their guess, but it's just a guess. You actually have to hear from people who are saying no, why? Make sure that there's a thank you to patients. A website is very nice. Post-study, I think it's important to have a final thank you. And it's very important to get the findings out to the patients and the community and to publish it so that oncologists know, well, we tried this and it didn't work. Otherwise, there's some other researcher sitting someplace figuring, I wonder about that. Why don't we try this? So it's really important that you encourage all findings to be published, and not just to the patients and the community, but also to the researchers. So I think one way to reach out to underrepresented communities, and actually to all communities, is to use the leaders that are already in that community. You can help develop new leaders. You can go to churches, schools, beauty parlors, barbershops, wherever. Find the organizations that are in that community that people trust, that people turn to, people go to, and give them the information about a clinical trial. Say, we've just opened this clinical trial. I know at ACOSOG, right, I think the year before it folded, we put together a big spreadsheet for each organ site and all the organizations that address those, so that any PI could look there and say, here's where we'll go. So if you don't have that in your network, make sure that you help people realize that that might be really beneficial. Put together, maybe as an advocate, community in your network that you can put that together for them. We did a lot of outreach to make sure that we included as many people as we could, but I think that's another thing that we can do as advocate groups within the network, is to help establish this kind of thinking. So here are some protections in place, and again, this is just background information. This is we won't spend a lot of time on it, but you'll know it. If anybody ever asks you about it, you can come back to this and look at it. There's actually federal laws. There's the National Commission. There's the Nuremberg Report, the Belmont Report, the National Research Act. All of these are federal laws that have to be addressed and followed. There's a lot of protections in place before a trial. There's the internal scientific review for your network, and that make sure that it's solid science, that you're not moving forward with a concept that isn't based on solid science. The disease committee would answer that. The steering committee should answer that. The external groups that are looking at it are the IRB. CTEP will be looking at that as submissions come in, and the FDA will as well. The patient-informed consent, all aspects have to be laid out in a way that protections are easily understood by patients. And then during a trial, again, the central IRB or the local IRB will be looking at this. And there's also a data safety monitoring board. And since any given IRB is only looking at their site, you want a DSMB, which was looking at all of the sites, and they're gathering all of the data and all of the adverse events and capturing it to ensure that risks are minimal and that the data is solid, and if need be, they can stop a study. They can stop a study if it's got adverse side events. They can also stop a study early if it looks very, 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 very promising. And this is a very vulnerable population, and you want that information out there as quick as you can. Sometimes a data safety monitoring board will say, okay, we're going to stop it early because the data looks so good, we're going to start using that. That doesn't happen often, but it does happen, and it can happen. So in summary, as an advocate, when you're looking through the consent form and the protocol, number one focus is improved outcomes. I mean, we really have to make sure that we don't start something that isn't going to be of benefit to patients. We want to look at the safety issues, extra visits, extra costs, really focus on feasibility and make sure that if there's any barriers there that they're removed, and if it's not feasible, be sure to say that. Make sure that consent form is really, really understandable. Encourage education materials. Encourage comparing to standard of care in any way that they can, in handouts. In some sites, they will have who's ever consenting draw it out for them if they don't have handouts. Encourage a schema that's in calendar time-like format, like I showed. So there are some things that we can do all the way through. That's why we're there in the network, is to make sure, again, that that concept and that protocol has as much chance of accruing and getting a good answer for patients. That's why we're there. So here's just some disclaimers as a nonprofit. But thank you so much to Patty, who has just helped all the way through as a consultant for our nonprofit, for Jane, and for helping to write the content, and to our funders, Genentech and Novartis. You can always go to our website for information, and we're now finished and available for questions. So you